Progressive rock is probably the style that develops in the 70s that is most consistent with the values of what I've been calling the hippie aesthetic. That is both its accomplishment and the major point of criticism from those who don't appreciate the style and consider its overwhelming ambition to amount to pomposity and pretentiousness. It was importantly developed in Britain. So most of the groups that we're going to talk about are British groups. There was an American progressive rock that happens in the 70s, but mostly it was an echo of what had been done by the British groups that we're going to talk about. There was a real obsession among the progressive rock bands with concept albums. Concept albums are the important thing, the big idea, the album, the artwork, all of that stuff sort of going together. They sort of lavished a lot of attention on those album covers, and some of them have become some of the most famous album covers in the history of rock. The lyrics addressed philosophical issues, not so much romance issues or issues of sexuality or that kind of thing. There was always, important issues about God and the state and existence and the universe and these kinds of things, which was part of this whole idea of trying to take the music seriously. So again, people who thought that the lyrics were maybe a little bit pretentious, that was why, because it seemed like amateur philosophy to some people. Lyrics that were more vague than meaningful, this kind of thing. But again, those are criticisms. I happen to be a big fan of this style. The style extended the idea that music should be a trip, which is something we talked about when we talked about the 60s and the late 60s, psychedelia, in the previous class. And it made a very self-conscious use of classical music, jazz. The songs were long, and there was lots of virtuosic display in most of this music. And so that's really what constitutes some of the key figures of progressive rock. The groups that anticipate progressive rock in the 70s are often called by people who study this music proto-prog. Proto-prog tracks, a representative sample of them, would be Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale, a number 5 hit in this country from 1967. Another great one, if you've never checked it out, is A Salty Dog from 1969. I happen to think that's a fantastic tune, extremely expressive. Think about the Moody Blues. Days of Future Past is a fantastic record that brings together the Moody Blues with an orchestra, so you're getting some of that kind of thing going on. An early group, The Nice, which turned into another band called Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which we'll return to. They were important during this period. But also The Who are very important. Now, a lot of people would say, well, The Who are not really a progressive rock band. It's true. They're not really a progressive rock band, but many of the features of their music are consistent with the values of progressive rock. Starting with Tommy, 1969, often called the first rock opera. It's not actually an opera, but the idea is that it tells sort of a conceptual story from beginning to end. Who's Next from 1971 was actually based on a conceptual project called Lifehouse. That's full of all kinds of elements of progressive rock. And Quadrophenia, another big concept album from 1974, based on the mod movement of the mid-1960s, which we talked about in the previous course, is a big double album kind of concept album with, and all of these, the packaging sort of participates in everything that's going on. So The Who maybe fit more comfortably in with some of the progressive rock groups than with maybe some more of the mainstream sort of blues-based groups that we talked about in the last couple of videos. Maybe the first big progressive rock album is In the Court of the Crimson King from 1969 by a group called King Crimson, run by guitarist Robert Fripp. It blended dissonant 20th century music and consonant 19th century classical music together with a real sort of pop and folk kind of influence to create really the template for what was going to follow in most progressive rock music after it. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as I said before, started was really, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were really based around Keith Emerson, the keyboard player, who was responsible for all the classical and virtuosic bits, and Greg Lake, the singer, guitarist, bass player of the group, who was really sort of the pop guy in the group. He had the songs. Them together, sort of knit together with Carl Palmer on drums. Keith Emerson started out with the Nice. In the period between 67 and 1970, they released a number of records that were famous for appropriating classical pieces. So you take a classical piece of music and you turn it into kind of a rock version of that. And so he did that a lot with the Nice, and did that as well with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So when we think about Emerson, Lake and Palmer, maybe their interesting contribution here is their adaptation of classical music. From 1971, Pictures at an Exhibition, their adaptation of the Mussorgsky piece is probably the best representative of that. Jethro Tull, another group that started as a blues-based group but sort of morphed into a more progressive group, at least for a period during the 1970s, led by flautist, singer, songwriter, guitarist Ian Anderson, often focused on issues of religion and spirituality with a kind of biting social critique. A good example of that is the 1971 album Aqualung. The title track, Aqualung, is maybe the most famous of the Jethro Tull tracks from the 1970s. Their later albums did not even separate tracks out, sort of ran just across an entire side of the record. So Thick as a Brick from 1972, you had side 1 and side 2, and a Passion Play that follows after that. Both of them very conceptual records. Thick as a Brick must take the prize for the most elaborate packaging, because when you opened the record up, when you opened the cover up, it was actually a multi-page newspaper based on a small kind of newspaper from a small British village or town. So very elaborate with, TV listings and crossword puzzles and comics and all the kinds of things you might expect in one of those things. The group Yes, another sort of important group, maybe thought of as maybe the kind of premier prog rock band of the era. A lot of virtuoso players in the group: Steve Howe on guitar, Rick Wakeman on keyboards, Chris Squire on bass, Bill Bruford, later Alan White on drums, and the distinctive high lead vocals of John Anderson. A very optimistic group, as if the name didn't already kind of give that away. A lot of explorations of spirituality in their music, but all very kind of vague and non-denominational in a certain kind of sense. Close to the Edge is probably thought of as the band's most accomplished record from 1972. The title track is based in part on Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. Hermann Hesse, a very important novelist to the counterculture. We already met a Hesse reference in the last video with the band Steppenwolf, which of course took its name from a Hermann Hesse novel as well. Anyway, a very ostentatious display in a lot of this music of their classical music influence. Genesis, the first version of Genesis actually had Peter Gabriel on lead vocals, and Phil Collins played drums in the band and did backup vocals. When Gabriel left the group in the middle of the decade, Phil Collins took over as lead vocalist, and of course they became the Genesis of the 80s that had all those hits. But initially, Peter Gabriel fronted the group. They focused on lengthy, carefully worked out arrangements with bizarre tales often crafted by Peter Gabriel, elaborate costumes to sort of act out some of these pieces, and stories in between the songs that Gabriel would develop that were almost sort of very sort of fantastic and surreal and full of kind of imagery and also a kind of cultural critique. Probably the album that is the most elaborate one, and the last one that Peter Gabriel did with the group, was the double album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974. Those performances were probably some of the most elaborately staged performances of their era, and unfortunately not much film remains of those performances, although tribute bands like a group called the Musical Box have gone to taken painstaking care to recreate the original Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour, so you can see what it looked like at the time. For its time, however, a real kind of high watermark in what you could do with rock theater, and we'll return to rock theater in one of the other videos from this week. The last group I want to talk about for a minute is Pink Floyd. There's a big argument on the internet. We get into these big arguments on the internet whether Pink Floyd counts as progressive rock, and I think in many ways it does. What's missing in progressive rock, in Pink Floyd, that's present in a lot of progressive rock, is these overt references to classical music and overt virtuosity. I think that David Gilmour is a fantastic guitar player. The musicianship in his playing is superb, but he's not a flashy player. He's not someone who sort of flaunts his virtuosity. His virtuosity is a kind of a virtuosity of musicality as opposed to one of technical display. And so in many ways, Pink Floyd don't fit from the classical quotation, virtuosity kind of element of it, but so much of the music is so conceptual from that point of view. The group was mostly led by bassist Roger Waters, who wrote a lot of the material after the departure of Syd Barrett, who you may remember from our lectures from the first half of the course, had a mental breakdown and left the group really after the first couple of singles and the first album, and David Gilmour came into the group. The group was not very well known in this country until they hit with Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, and gosh, what an album, a real classic, an album that never had fantastic, top of the chart success like some of the other groups did, but it stuck around forever. At one point was the album that had been longest on the Billboard Top 200 charts than any album in the history of that chart. The music is often focused on aspects of madness, insanity, isolation or alienation. Also, the horror of the Second World War figures a lot into Roger Waters' lyrics. Probably when we talk about the history of rock music staging or theatricality, we have to think about The Wall from 1979. And we talked about a minute ago the Lamb Lies Down Broadway from 74 as being a high point. By the time we get to 1979 and The Wall, that's probably the most elaborately staged rock show you could go and see. And there were other ones that would compete with it. A Kiss show, for example, we'll talk about them soon enough. A Kiss show would be a very elaborate thing. An Alice Cooper show might be a very elaborate kind of thing. A David Bowie show. But The Wall was almost like doing a Broadway musical in the sense that everybody had marks on the stage. They had to be at certain particular times. It was extremely worked out. I often mark The Wall as the end of the hippie aesthetic in a certain sense because it's the last big concept album of the decade. Well, that's the story on progressive rock. Let's turn to another sort of musicianly kind of style for the next video, and that's jazz rock.